He knew my favorite song, my worst fear, my childhood trauma. But in class, he didn't even say hi. We never talked in the hallway, not once, not even a smile or a nod that could be mistaken for politeness. Yet every night after midnight, my phone lit up as if it had been waiting for him all day, as if darkness was the only permission our connection needed to exist. It always began the same way. A simple message, you awake, and I always answered immediately. Not because I was desperate, but because some part of me had learned that these hours belonged to us, that this was when I was allowed to be seen. He asked about my day with patience, not just what happened, but how it made me feel, what drained me, what I pretended didn't hurt, and I found myself opening doors inside me that had stayed locked for years. He remembered everything, my fear of raised voices, the way math class made me feel small, the song that made my chest ache for reasons I could never explain. And every time he brought one of those details up, I felt chosen, like I mattered enough to be remembered. At night, he listened, really listened, and his replies felt careful and warm, like he was holding something fragile, and that fragile thing was me. I told him things I had never said out loud, not to friends, not even to myself. And when I finished typing, I would stare at the screen with my heart racing, afraid I had said too much, only for him to respond with words that made my throat tighten. He said my thoughts were beautiful, that I saw the world differently, that my voice mattered, and every sentence stitched another piece of hope into me. When my phone buzzed, I felt important, seen, almost safe, like somewhere in the world there was a person who knew me deeply and chose me anyway. Then morning came. In class, he sat 3 rows ahead, laughing loudly, leaning back in his chair, surrounded by people who never knew my name, while I watched him walk past me every day, so close our sleeves almost brushed, yet never close enough to be acknowledged. The first time it happened, I told myself he didn't notice me. The second time, I decided he was shy. The third time, something inside me quietly cracked. I replayed his messages during lectures, his words soft and intimate, wondering how the same person could exist in 2 versions, one who held my thoughts at night and another who erased me by day. Once I lifted my hand, just slightly, barely enough to count as a wave, and he looked straight through me, not past me, through me, as if I was made of air. That night, he texted, "Sorry, today was crazy," and I typed and erased the same question until my fingers hurt, finally asking why he never talked to me at school. There was a pause, longer than usual, and then he replied, "It's complicated," and I accepted it because midnight felt safer than daylight, because half love felt better than no love. Even as a quiet voice inside me whispered a question I wasn't ready to answer, would you accept a love that only exists after midnight? After he said it was complicated, I stopped asking questions, not because my curiosity disappeared, but because I was afraid of the answers, afraid that if I pushed too hard, the midnight version of him would vanish too, and I was not ready to lose the only place where I felt chosen. Days passed like that, quiet and heavy, my mornings filled with watching him from a distance while pretending not to care, my nights filled with his words wrapping around me like reassurance that I replayed again and again until sleep finally came. In the classroom, I learned how to shrink myself, how to sit a little straighter, speak a little softer, laugh a little less, as if taking up less space might somehow make me easier to acknowledge, or at least easier to ignore without pain. He joked loudly with others, confident and relaxed, the kind of boy teachers remembered and classmates admired, and every time someone said his name out loud, it felt strange because to me his real voice existed only through a screen. Once our eyes met for half a second, accidental and sharp, and my heart jumped, ready for recognition, but he looked away instantly like he had touched something forbidden, and the moment dissolved before I could hold it. At lunch, I sat with friends who talked about parties and crushes and weekend plans, nodding at the right moments, while my phone stayed face down beside my tray, silent in the daylight, useless until night returned. They asked if I was okay because I'd started drifting, smiling slower, responding later, and I said I was just tired, because it was easier than explaining that part of me only came alive after midnight. At night, he was gentle, asking if I had eaten, if I was resting enough, reminding me to believe in myself. And sometimes I wondered how someone could care so deeply in private while pretending indifference in public without breaking in two. I almost confronted him once, standing near his desk after class, rehearsing the words in my head, but the way his friends surrounded him made my courage fold in on itself, and I walked past instead, my chest tight with relief and regret. That night, he sent a long message, telling me about his stress, his image, the expectations people had of him, and how everything felt easier when it was just us talking in the dark. I listened, because that was what I was good at, because he trusted me with the parts of himself he hid from everyone else, and that trust felt like proof that what we had was real. Still, something shifted inside me, a slow, uncomfortable realization that while he was afraid of losing his image, I was the one losing pieces of myself, trading daylight confidence for nighttime affection. I stared at the ceiling after we said goodnight, wondering when I had started measuring my worth by unread messages and avoided eye contact, and whether love was supposed to make you feel this small. Have you ever made yourself smaller just to keep someone close? The realization didn't arrive all at once, it settled slowly, quietly, like dust collecting in corners you stop noticing, until one day I understood that I was not just someone he cared about, I was something he was hiding. That thought followed me everywhere, through crowded hallways and silent bus rides, through afternoons where my phone stayed dark, and evenings when I waited for midnight like it was permission to exist again. When he finally texted each night, relief washed over me first, followed closely by guilt because I hated how much control those 3 vibrating dots had over my mood. He asked what I was doing, and I lied sometimes, saying I was fine, saying I was busy, because I wanted to see if he would notice the distance, if he would fight to close it, but he never did. He simply filled the silence with his own words. He told me how different I was from everyone else, How conversations with me felt deeper, safer, more honest. And every time he said that, I wondered why something so special had to stay invisible. Once late at night, he admitted that people at school wouldn't understand us, that they liked simple things and simple girls, and that what we had was too complicated to explain. I stared at that message for a long time, my fingers cold against the screen, realizing he had drawn a line without saying it directly, a line between the girl he could talk to in secret and the girl he would never stand beside in public. The next day, I watched him laugh with a girl everyone admired, the kind of girl teachers praised and students followed, and when she touched his arm, he didn't pull away. The contrast hurt more than I expected, not because I wanted to be her, but because he was capable of being seen with someone else, just not with me. That night, I asked him a question I had avoided for weeks, asking if he was embarrassed by me, and the pause that followed felt heavier than any answer. When he finally replied, he didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. Instead, he talked about timing and pressure and how people talk too much, and I understood that this was his way of protecting himself at my expense. I told myself I should leave, that I deserved more than secret affection and stolen hours, yet when he said he needed me, that I understood him like no one else, I stayed. There was comfort in being needed, even when being needed came with conditions, even when it meant learning how to love quietly. But something inside me hardened that night, a small protective layer forming around my heart because I could no longer pretend I didn't know the truth. I wasn't hidden because we were private. I was hidden because he was afraid of what choosing me would cost him. And knowing that changed everything, even if I wasn't ready to admit it yet. Is being someone's secret ever the same as being loved? After that night, something between us shifted, not in the way that breaks loudly, but in the quiet way that changes how you breathe. Because once you recognize silence as an answer, you can never unhear it. I stopped checking my phone as often during the day, not because I cared less, but because hope had started to hurt. And every time I caught myself waiting, I felt embarrassed by how much power I'd handed over. In class, I noticed things I had ignored before, how easily he greeted others, how natural his smile looked when it was meant for someone safe, how confidently he existed when I was not part of the picture. Once a teacher paired us for a short activity, nothing serious, just 5 minutes of shared space, and my heart raced like it was about to be exposed. But he kept his voice neutral, polite, distant, as if we were strangers who had never shared midnight confessions. I answered his questions calmly, my hands steady, even though inside I felt foolish for expecting something more. And when the activity ended, he walked away without hesitation. That was the moment I understood that the version of him I loved was not incomplete, it was selective, and I was only allowed access when no one else was watching. That night, he sensed the difference in me immediately, asking why I felt far away, telling me he missed how open I usually was, and for the first time, I didn't rush to reassure him. I told him the truth carefully, saying that it hurt to be close only in the dark, that it made me feel small and uncertain and unseen, and my honesty felt like standing at the edge of something irreversible. He replied with understanding words but no action, saying he wished things were easier, saying he cared deeply, saying he hoped I understood, and each sentence felt like a soft excuse wrapped in affection. I realized then that understanding had become my role, that I was expected to absorb discomfort quietly so he could remain comfortable, admired, untouched by consequence. The days that followed felt heavier, like I was carrying something unspoken everywhere I went, and I started noticing how often I chose silence, how often I swallowed reactions, how often I pretended I was okay when I wasn't. Friends laughed around me while I drifted further inside myself, questioning how love could exist without courage and why I had accepted a version of connection that asked me to disappear halfway. At night, his messages still arrived, familiar and warm, but now they carried weight because I knew what they cost me, and every reply felt like a decision I was consciously making. I wasn't ready to walk away yet, but I was no longer unaware, and that awareness made everything sharper, clearer, harder to ignore. Sometimes knowing the truth is more painful than the truth itself because it forces you to choose between comfort and self-respect. At what point does understanding someone turn into betraying yourself? I began to notice how often I edited myself around him, choosing softer words, hiding sharper feelings, turning my hurt into something easier to digest, because I was afraid that if I became too real, he would disappear, and losing him felt scarier than losing parts of myself. During the day, I moved through school like a shadow, present but unnoticed. While he existed loudly and confidently, his name spoken freely, his laughter echoing down hallways that never echoed with mine. Sometimes I caught people watching me watch him, and the awareness made my stomach twist because I wondered if they could see how much of my world revolved around someone who refused to stand beside me. At night, he told me I was his calm, his safe place, the one person who understood him without judgment, and hearing that made me feel special for a moment, until I realized that safety for him meant secrecy for me. I asked myself questions I had avoided before, wondering why love had to feel like compromise instead of partnership, and why I was always the one bending, waiting, adjusting. One evening, he sent a picture of a group hanging out. Nothing dramatic, just friends smiling, and I stared at it longer than I should have, noticing how easily he existed in that space, how naturally he belonged. I wanted to ask why I was never invited, never included, never even mentioned, but the words stayed trapped in my throat because asking felt like demanding, and I had learned to survive on what was offered, not what was deserved. That night, our conversation felt strained, his replies shorter, his warmth distracted, and I wondered if my quiet distance had made me less convenient, less comforting, less useful. The thought hurt more than I expected, realizing that part of my value to him came from how little I asked for. I remembered the girl I used to be before midnight conversations defined my worth, the version of me who laughed without checking her phone, who spoke freely, who believed attention should feel mutual. Somewhere along the way, I had started measuring myself by his availability, by how quickly he replied, by how gentle his words were, and that realization made my chest ache with shame. I wasn't weak, I told myself, just hopeful. But hope without action began to feel like a slow erosion, wearing me down quietly while pretending to be patient. When he said goodnight that evening, I didn't feel comforted. I felt empty, because love that asks you to disappear during the day eventually teaches you to disappear from yourself. I lay awake longer than usual, staring into the dark, wondering how long I could keep choosing silence before silence became all that was left of me. For the first time, the idea of leaving didn't feel impossible. It felt terrifying, but also strangely relieving, like imagining fresh air after being underwater too long. How long would you stay in a love that only works when you ask for nothing? That night, something inside me reached a quiet edge. Not dramatic, not loud, just a stillness that felt heavier than pain, because pain at least means you are fighting, and I was tired of fighting myself. His message came later than usual, a casual apology followed by familiar warmth, and for the first time I didn't feel relieved when I saw his name light up my screen. I felt tired. He talked about his day, about jokes and plans and people I would never meet, and I listened the way I always had, carefully, attentively, even as a small voice inside me asked why my presence only mattered when no one else could see it. I almost said it then, almost told him I couldn't do this anymore, that loving him quietly was costing me too much, but fear wrapped around my honesty and held it still. Instead, I asked a softer question, asking if he had ever imagined what it would be like if things were different, if we didn't have to hide behind screens in silence. He paused, and in that pause, I felt the weight of my answer already forming, because deep down I knew what he would say. When he replied, he said he liked what we had, that it felt safe, that changing it might ruin everything, and his words landed gently but firmly, like a door closing without a sound. I realized then that I was the only one imagining more, the only one hoping midnight would someday turn into morning, while he was perfectly content living in the dark. The realization hurt, but it also clarified something important, that love should not feel like waiting for permission, and connection should not require invisibility. I put my phone down and stared at the ceiling, letting the silence stretch, letting the discomfort exist without rushing to soothe it. And in that quiet, I felt a version of myself I had been ignoring for too long. She was tired but honest, hurt but awake, and she wanted more than secret affection and careful words. When I finally replied, my message was shorter than usual, honest without explanation, saying I needed time to think, and my hands trembled as I sent it. His response came quickly, concern mixed with confusion, asking if he had done something wrong, and I realized how strange it was that he noticed distance in messages, but never noticed my absence during the day. I didn't answer right away because for once I wanted to choose myself before choosing comfort. That night I slept without my phone in my hand, without rereading old messages, without waiting for words to validate my existence, and it felt unfamiliar and lonely and strangely peaceful all at once. I didn't know yet what I would do next, but I knew something had changed because once you imagine letting go, staying the same becomes impossible. Have you ever reached a moment where staying felt harder than leaving? The morning after I asked for space felt different. Not lighter, not easier, just quieter, in a way that made every thought echo. And as I got ready for school, I kept reaching for my phone out of habit, then stopping myself, reminding my hands that they no longer had a reason to wait. Walking into class, I noticed how often I had used distraction to survive, how checking messages had filled empty moments, and without it, everything felt exposed, my thoughts louder, my emotions harder to avoid. He was there like always, surrounded by noise and movement, laughing freely, untouched by the distance that had kept me awake most of the night, and seeing that made something inside me settle into clarity. If I was hurting this much from pulling away and he wasn't, then the imbalance had always been there. I'd just been ignoring it. During the lecture, I focused harder than usual, forcing my attention forward instead of drifting toward him, and it surprised me how much mental space opened up when I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. At lunch, my friends noticed the difference, not in words, but in the way I stayed present, laughed fully, listened without drifting, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again, not divided between day and night. He didn't text that evening, and the absence felt loud at first, my body bracing for something that never came, but slowly the urge to check softened, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. I realized how exhausting it had been to live in anticipation, measuring my worth by timing and tone, and how freeing it felt to exist without being on standby. That night, I wrote things down, not messages for him, but truths for myself, reminding me that love should feel steady, not conditional, and that being chosen in private was not the same as being chosen at all. The next day, he finally approached me after class, standing too close and speaking too softly, asking if I was okay, and for a moment, my heart reacted before my mind could catch up. I told him I was fine, honestly, because I was, and the simplicity of that truth surprised both of us. He looked uncomfortable, unsure, as if my calm unsettled him more than my silence ever had, and that realization gave me strength. When he walked away, I didn't follow with my eyes, didn't replay the moment, didn't wait for explanation because I understood something important. I was learning how to exist without needing him to see me, and that kind of independence felt like reclaiming parts of myself I had misplaced. It wasn't happiness yet, but it was movement, and movement meant I was no longer stuck in the dark waiting for someone else to turn on the light. Have you ever realized your absence hurt you more than it hurt them? By the end of the week, the silence between us had stretched thin enough to feel fragile, like one wrong word could tear it open, and I sensed that something was coming even before it did. He asked if we could talk, not at night, not through a screen, but in person, and the request alone made my chest tighten because daylight conversations had never been part of us. We met after class near the empty stairwell, a place quiet enough to feel private, but visible enough to remind me why he had always avoided moments like this. He looked nervous, shifting his weight, avoiding my eyes, and for the first time, I saw him without the confidence he wore so easily around others. He said he missed me, that things felt off, that he didn't like the distance, and hearing those words in daylight felt strange, almost unreal. I listened without interrupting, letting him speak until the truth slipped out between pauses and excuses, until he finally admitted what I had known for a long time. He said he was scared of how things would look, scared of what people would say, scared of losing his place, his image, his ease, and then he said the words that settled everything. He said I wasn't unpopular, just not popular enough. The sentence landed softly but deeply, sinking into places I didn't know were still tender, and for a moment I couldn't speak. I thought about every night I'd felt special, every message that made me believe I was chosen, and how all of it had existed within limits he had decided without me. I asked him calmly if he realized what he was saying, if he understood that he had reduced me to a risk calculation, and the way his face fell told me he hadn't expected honesty. He said he cared, that this didn't change how he felt, that I mattered to him, and I believed him in the way you believe someone who doesn't realize how much harm they have already done. I told him that caring without courage was not love, that connection without respect was not enough, and that I had spent too long making myself small so he could feel safe. My voice didn't shake, not because I wasn't hurt, but because clarity had replaced confusion. And clarity is steady. When I walked away, I didn't look back, not out of pride, but out of self-preservation, because staying would have meant reopening a door I had finally closed. That night he texted, long messages filled with regret and apologies, but I read them without urgency, understanding that words after truth carry less weight. I didn't reply immediately because for once my peace mattered more than his comfort, and that choice felt like the quiet beginning of something new. Would you walk away after hearing the truth, even if love was still there? The days after that conversation felt raw and unfamiliar, like stepping into sunlight after living too long in dim rooms, everything brighter, sharper, harder to ignore. He avoided me now, not out of confidence but discomfort, and the distance that once belonged only to me had shifted, finally resting where it should have all along. I noticed how quickly people adjusted to my presence when I stopped shrinking, how conversations flowed more easily when I wasn't half listening for my phone to vibrate. For the first time in months, my nights were quiet, not empty, just open, and I filled them with things that belonged entirely to me. Music I loved, thoughts I didn't censor, sleep that wasn't interrupted by waiting. Sometimes his name still crossed my mind, usually late out of habit, but the ache had softened into something manageable, a reminder rather than a wound. I realized how much energy I'd spent justifying someone else's fear, how often I had confused patience with loyalty, and how little space I had left for myself because of it. In class, I spoke up more, raised my hand without worrying who was watching, laughed without checking my surroundings, and each small action felt like reclaiming territory I'd given away. One afternoon, a friend asked why I seemed different, stronger somehow, and I smiled because I finally had an answer that didn't revolve around someone else. He texted once, a simple message asking how I was, and I answered politely, honestly, without reopening anything that no longer fit me. The power in that moment surprised me, not because I had control over him, but because I had control over myself. I understood then that love should never require you to wait for darkness, to hide in corners, to accept half presence as full connection. What we had taught me something important, not about him, but about the version of me that had accepted less because she believed it was all she deserved. I forgave her quietly, knowing she had done the best she could with what she knew at the time. As the weeks passed, I stopped associating midnight with validation, stopped equating attention with worth, and slowly rebuilt a sense of self that didn't depend on secrecy. I didn't hate him, and I didn't regret what we shared, because even pain can carry lessons when you let it. What mattered was that I chose myself openly, in daylight, without conditions, and that choice felt more honest than any midnight confession ever had. What changed for you when you finally chose yourself? Time did what honesty had started. It settled the chaos, softened the sharpest edges, and gave me enough distance to see the story clearly without falling back into it. I no longer measured days by whether he noticed me, no longer counted hours until midnight, no longer felt my chest tighten when my phone stayed quiet because silence had stopped meaning rejection. Sometimes I still thought about the girl I was back then, the one who waited in the dark, believing that private affection was proof of depth, and I felt tenderness for her instead of shame. She didn't know yet that love should not ask you to disappear, that connection should not require secrecy, and that being chosen quietly is often a warning, not a gift. I saw him occasionally, passing in hallways, standing with friends, living a life that no longer intersected with mine, and there was no bitterness in it, only understanding. We had shared something real, but real does not always mean right, and caring does not always mean capable. What stayed with me was not his words, not the late-night messages or promises that never reached daylight, but the lesson his absence taught me. I learned that if someone is proud of you only in private, they are not proud of you at all, and if they love you only when it is convenient, they do not love you in the way you deserve. The nights grew easier, filled with rest instead of waiting, and the mornings felt lighter, no longer weighed down by invisibility. I found confidence not in being chosen, but in choosing myself consistently, publicly, without apology. One evening, long after the story had ended, my phone buzzed past midnight, an unknown number lighting up the screen, and for a brief second, muscle memory kicked in. I looked at it, then placed my phone face down and turned off the light, because some chapters do not deserve revisiting, no matter how familiar they feel. Love, I learned, should not exist only in shadows. It should stand comfortably in the open, imperfect, but present. And if someone cannot meet you in daylight, cannot say your name without fear, cannot hold your presence without calculating cost, then their feelings are not something you should carry. I didn't lose love. I outgrew a version of it that asked me to stay small. And in doing so, I found something steadier, quieter, and stronger. I found myself no longer waiting for midnight, no longer hidden, no longer willing to be loved in pieces. Would you choose a love that hides you or a life where you never have to hide again?